Hello and welcome to Planet Poetry. My name's Robin Houghton.
And I'm Peter Kenny. And in this episode, things get strangely cute. We're meeting Isabel Galleymore and talking about her Cuteness collection, Baby Schema.
And I'll be talking a bit about my visit to the Foyle Young Poets of the Year Awards and also reading one of the winning poems by 18-year-old Indy Moon. Plus, a young poet from yesteryear will be here to read a classic autumn favourite for us. Don't miss that.
But before all that golden autumnal stuff, let's hear what Isabel Galleymore had to say to Robin.
Isabel Gallymore's first collection, Significant Other, won the John Pollard Foundation International Poetry Prize in 2020. It was also shortlisted for the Forward Best First Collection Prize and the Seamus Heaney First Collection Prize. She held the position of Walter Jackson Bate Fellow at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study in 2022-23. In 2024, Isabel's second collection, Baby Schema, published by Cuteness, was a Poetry Book Society recommendation and longlisted for the Laurel Prize. Isabel Galleymore, welcome to Planet Poetry.
Hi, thank you so much for welcoming me and inviting me here to talk.
Tell us where in the world you are at the moment.
I am sitting in my office at the University of Birmingham. I live in Birmingham and it's a sunnier day than I expected it to be. It was a wet start, so yeah, it's nice to be indoors actually.
Well, we're here to talk about your second full collection, Baby Schema. Love the title straight away, very intriguing. It's not often that I pick up a book and I'm really surprised from the start about what it's about. And I was this time, and it kind of appealed to me on a slightly guilty level as someone who quite likes to scroll through Instagram looking at funny videos of kittens and puppies doing naughty things. Because there's this central theme of what you call a cutesy aesthetic, isn't there? Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Of course, yes. So this really started for me in my last book, probably, where I was exploring the idea of anthropomorphism in Significant Other. This was back in 2019. And I was really curious about the ways in which we attribute human characteristics to animals. And I suppose one end of the spectrum of that is that cutesy aesthetic, where we really do make animals into kind of human counterparts. And we can see that in the work of, Beatrix Potter and Peter Rabbit and all those little cute characters. And I suppose anthropomorphism has there's a negativity associated with it, I think, where we think we shouldn't be imposing ourselves on the natural world.
Yeah.
And I like to challenge that a little bit. And so I was curious. Cuteness seems to me even worse than anthropomorphism. It seems like the pinnacle of what you shouldn't do in a poem about the natural world. And so I wanted to try it out with writing this book, and it brought me so much joy. It also brought me a lot of kind of concern, because I think cuteness, although it's full of kind of prettiness and purity and innocence, it also has its kind of dark side as well. So yeah, it was a really interesting journey writing this book for sure.
I think it's a really interesting topic of investigation. And as we go through the poems that you're going to read for us, I think we'll see exactly what you mean by that. There's a slight darkness to it, which hadn't really occurred to me before, I don't think. So this is why I was really enthralled by it. Perhaps you could lead us into the book with a poem. How about Forever It Appears, which I think is the first poem of the collection, isn't it?
Yes, and there's definitely a little bit of darkness in this poem. Forever it appears. I wake and find it's day again. It happens every time. It makes no difference if I crush the day between my hands, or wring, or drop, or squish the day as if it were the frog. The frog, bath sponge, instinctively returns to its set shape. I watch its simple eyes, so soft, reopening like ours. Forever, it appears, expecting to be taken care of.
Thank you. Yes, that's expecting to be taken care of. It kind of sets the scene for the whole book, this idea of taking care of someone or something, also suggesting a a need and a responsibility, but also an expectation. So there's this tension already, I think, here, isn't there?
Absolutely. I was really curious about the ways in which cuteness might elicit a kind of maternal desire. It might tap into a maternal instinct, so that the frog bath sponge or a stuffed animal toy on the shelf of a shop manages to kind of obscure the fact that you're buying it because actually you want to take care of it.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a central thread in the book.
Yes, I like the way the beginning of this poem, it starts quite somberly, and then we meet the frog bath sponge and this word squish, which immediately suggests something a little bit more like play, and we get squishiness later on in the book as well. It sort of jumped out at me, that really nice word choice. So you're saying that it obscures a kind of a commercial thing, that, actually something's being sold to us. Also, you do go on to explore the idea of, when does a child become an adult, or does a child have adult anxieties? And the opposite, are adults indulging in infantile emotions, and where do those two overlap? Is that true to say?
Yeah, I was curious, I suppose, especially as you introduced your own perhaps interest in cuteness, looking at Instagram videos of kittens and bunnies and puppies or whatever they may be. I'm exactly the same. This is something which I'm perhaps more curious about, in all its sides and all its difficult facets, but it's something that I also really enjoy, and I do take a lot of pleasure in watching these videos. But it's curious how, I suppose, more and more we're being told that adult generations are more infantile. So, millennials are supposedly snowflakes.
Oh, yes,
and,
yes.
this new verb of adulting, which never used to be a thing, So in a sense, we're all still children.
Adulting. So what is adulting? Can you use that in a sentence for me? I think that's one's passed me by.
I think it's the kind of thing where you might say, why is adulting so hard? Or like I need to get on with my adulting, or there's some kind of sense that we're kind of performatively adults. We can perform that, but we're not really.
Right. Interesting.
And that's something I certainly do feel, especially, thinking about the uncertain future to come and the environmental crisis, which comes into this book a little bit. There was a realization as I was writing these poems that actually, wouldn't it be easier to be a child and to let go of responsibility and feelings of guilt? But then I kind of had the shocking revelation, I suppose, that actually being a child is not what we think it to be anymore. That actually, with people like Greta Thunberg and the school strike for climate movement, children are taking it upon themselves to be responsible for environmental issues and often doing more than adults.
And more exposed to these things than they would have been, 40 years ago, I guess, as well.
That's absolutely true.
I wondered if you could read the poem that actually the book is named for, Baby Schemer. Maybe tell us a bit about that as well before you read it, please.
So baby schemer is a phrase that comes to us from an anthropologist called Konrad Lorenz. And he described baby schemer as being a set of visual indicators that are based on infantile features. So big eyes, chubby cheeks, a kind of softness of body, a stubbiness of limb. And it's these visual features that create a sense of vulnerability, which in turn trigger in us a caregiving behaviour. And so that vulnerability is really what cuteness is, I think. Those big eyes, chubby cheeks, that softness. So I suppose it's often thought of as a blueprint for cuteness. So, the frog bath sponge is based on baby schema. Even the cute alien image is based on baby schema. Everything that you think of as cute is usually based in some way on the baby's face. So this is a poem that starts to think about that and starts to pick up on the ways in which baby schema doesn't begin and end with the baby.
Uh-huh.
Baby schema. I like the word mother only because I'm still a child, or want to be, the one cared for, no debt, nothing on file. To shrug off adulthood the way the statue on the street has let his stone head wear away to a chubby-cheeked, big-eyed roundedness that stares, bemused, perhaps concerned. How I stare when I see the child next door who drags a watering can between wilting shrubs, like a child and not at all.
It's extraordinary that it starts with the speaker arguing with herself about the word mother and how and why it appeals, and the statue representing adulthood that has let itself be worn away, the passivity of that. It's rather careless, I think, and revealed something cuter. And then we have the child who's struggling to revive the wilting flowers, being worn away with the responsibility. I think there's so much wrapped up in this.
Mm.
I remember in the 1990s there was that craze for the Tamagotchi, those egg watch things that you had to take care of or else they died. And I'm wondering if they were the first inventions designed to answer the need for something to take care of. And yet they were marketed to children. It was quite a significant thing. I mean, I didn't have one, but I really remembered this.
They were huge, weren't they? I definitely had one or two or three, and I don't know where they are now.
Yeah.
And it's really curious, isn't it, the way in which children, even, babies to some extent, will be looking after versions of themselves, whether that's in terms of dolls or in terms of, as you say, Tamagotchis. So this desire to parent in some way is instilled in us, or perhaps, is within us from a very early age.
In girls only?
I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Tamagotchis were fairly gender neutral, I think.
Yeah.
But definitely that kind of doll culture. And certainly I did have a doll who features in the book as well. And I was not a very good child parent to my doll at all. In fact, I think she lost an arm during the time that she was with me.
Doesn't she appear later in the book and you admit sort of chucking her over the hedge a few times?
That's exactly it. She ends up on the roof and my mum has to go and get her. Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because also we're bringing in other aspects of nature. So the idea of the wilting shrubs in this poem, but we get the pot plant thing later. And that's another thing that one can easily anthropomorphize about. I know if I pull a plant up or I throw out a seedling that's died, I say sorry and thank you for having a go. I can't help myself.
That's lovely. How a lovely little communication you have with them. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because more and more we hear about plant moms. So you can be a plant mum, or you can be a pet mom. And that's something that I don't know if I've made a decision on yet. I think, on the one hand, it can be really refreshing to see kind of different understandings of family and kinship being offered by plants and pets. And, currently I do not have any human babies, and I do have lots of plants, and I have a little cat called Maisie. So I'm quite on the fence about whether or not to bring that language of parenthood into these non-human creatures.
Yes, it can be tricky, can't it? I mean, I have a lovely cat, but I would never call him a fur baby.
Right.
It makes me feel a bit cringy, but one can't criticise that, really.
Each to their own. I mean, there's no harm in it, for sure.
No,
and I do find myself talking to my cat and calling her little baby very often, and without any intention. It just happens. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of pleasure to be had in those moments. She's very cute.
I think we just need to take a little step into the darker territory here. And maybe you could read this poem, Squeeze-a-Mole.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. Squeeze-a-Mole. I had left the house, citing a walk. 6 p.m, a few degrees above freezing. On somebody's dashboard, a soft toy, lilac-furred and smiling. Baby monkey-esque, a breast measure of squishiness. It possessed an explicitly loving gaze I might have judged mildly obscene, but that evening I needed to find the soft toy benign. The soft toy was eager to love me, and it did so, I felt, comprehensively. In that moment, on the street, a stranger passed between us, and I saw how its moon-eyed look remained, adoring him just as much as me, presumably capable of adoring wholesale. It was so indiscriminate in its loving, I couldn't help feeling angry, disappointed in myself.
The soft toy was eager to love me. The language, we've got the breast and the squishiness and the seduction. And I just thought, oh God, even just the words soft and toy are straight from the world of porn and the male gaze. You know, as soon as you let your mind wander into that aspect of it, you see something you don't want to see, really.
Yeah, there's definitely that side to cuteness, I think, where the kind of innocence and the erotic can come together in quite disturbing ways often.
Yeah. And the way that the speaker feels disappointed in herself, like you've given in to something that you shouldn't have done, or just you've believed in something that was ridiculous. It's quite sort of sad, really.
On the one hand, I think there's definitely that way of thinking about cuteness where we're sold a bit of a lie, and the love that this soft toy is giving us is not real, and actually, you know, kind of unpleasant and for everyone and meaningless. But in other ways, it's curious because when I wrote this poem, I was thinking about another poem. And this was a poem by D.H. Lawrence, which a friend had sent it to me because he knew I was interested in looking at cuteness. And this poem by D.H. Lawrence is about a French bulldog, so inherently cute. And it's a poem called Bibbles. And Bibbles is the name of this French bulldog who D.H. Lawrence fell in love with, I think, because it was so cute, even though cute wasn't necessarily a word that he probably would have used.
Yeah.
And this poem that he wrote was a kind of rant about how cute this dog was. This dog was wriggling and jiggling and, you know, just loving everybody. But for D.H. Lawrence, that was a problem because he felt that by loving everyone, that dog wasn't faithful to him. And so this dog, Bibbles, becomes kind of a metaphor for an unfaithful woman. And it actually becomes quite a violent and unpleasant poem towards the end.
Gosh.
And so, you know, on the one hand, there's that strange sexualization of cuteness that can occur. And then I suppose on the other, there's the possibility that cuteness is actually so generous, you know, by loving everyone, it isn't discriminate.
Yeah.
And so that ending of the poem where I say, you know, I couldn't help feeling angry, disappointed in myself. Yes, I mean, it could be that I am disappointed in being manipulated by cuteness. But it could also be that, well, I wanted it maybe to have the possible reading of kind of being disappointed that I'm not cute and not all loving of everyone and everything.
I didn't read it that way, but that's another way of looking at it. Yeah, that's really interesting. So this contrast between real animals and their cartoon or toy versions, I remember in the 70s, I think it probably was, there were these Japanese cartoons started to appear on TV and all the characters had these huge eyes, which actually could be quite frightening, but it did somehow make, you know, the proportions of the face did comply to what you were talking about, a baby schema with the big eyes. And that's become a standard thing in Disney films, hasn't it? That the heroines and the heroes, I think, all have these big, lovely big eyes. And you did a research trip to Disneyland Paris, didn't you? Tell us about that.
Yes, it's not the usual research trip some might think I should be doing, but it felt very necessary to kind of go to the heartland of cuteness in some ways. I kind of grew up not really being that engaged with Disney. I don't quite know why that was. I'm an only child and my parents are a bit older than some parents might have been. And so Disney just wasn't something that was really on the TV or something to visit. So at the age of, 34? I went to Disneyland for the first time, Disneyland Paris. And I mean, it was kind of everything I thought it would be and more, but not necessarily in a positive way.
Oh, really?
I mean, it was full of cuteness and, of course, you know, just the kind of sensory overload, not only the visual sense of cuteness and those big eyes that you were describing, but also the kind of smells, you know, the candy floss and the popcorn and this kind of cute scentscape. That was a real surprise to be immersed in such a cute landscape, but at the same time, I think it had its own dark side. It may be the happiest place on earth, but it's still taking your money. There's a real desire to get people in and maybe out as quickly as possible. And so, you know, I was seeing a woman breastfeed her child in the shade of a fake shop front, you know, and just really strange, slightly austere images that came from, you know, a landscape that is to produce joy, but also to produce money.
And you talk about the fact that they've manipulated the actual landscape. So where there used to be, a lake, maybe the lake is still there with some real ducks on it, but then, next to it, there's Donald Duck prancing about in his costume. And so and I liked that idea of the real ducks and then the toy ducks. And the children probably weren't looking at the real ducks because the senses are assaulted by all the colours and the sounds and the action rather than nature, which is quite subdued, I suppose, in contrast.
Disneyland Paris was built on farmland originally. And so it's really interesting to think about how some of those parts of the theme park that rely on a slightly more rustic way of living. So I'm thinking about like the Pinocchio ride I went on, for instance. There's a scene of the countryside within this dark enclosed space in which you're trundled along a scene with Pinocchio and the story of Pinocchio. But of course that's on land that would have been the real countryside.
Yes.
So lots of really strange ways of making the real artificial. Really peculiar space.
So you came away and wrote this long poem, Disneyland, which appears in the central section of the book. There's something else interesting about this. You've introduced a kind of a form, a restraint on how you wrote it. Tell me what that was all about.
So my experience at Disneyland was mixed in the sense that I was there on a research trip, so I had to be, fairly serious about it all. And people have sometimes asked me, well, what was your research methodology? And I have to say, I didn't have one. But, just to take in as much as I could and to make notes. But I was very aware every time I opened my notebook in Disneyland Paris, people were watching me, kind of, what is she doing?
Yeah.
Which comes into the long poem, what is she doing with a notebook open? So whilst I was there, I was making lots of notes and I didn't really know how to deal with what was a kind of overwhelming place to be. It was maximalist, everything was extreme.
Yeah.
And where to or how to fit that into a poem without just going on about it forever and ever and ever across many, many pages. And so the constraint that I chose to use was to do with syllables. So when I visited Disneyland, I think it was the 100th year of the Walt Disney Company. And so to give myself some kind of constraint to stop this being kind of completely over the top, I chose to give myself 100 syllables per page of this sequence. And I actually really fell in love with this constraint because there was something so economic and thoughtful and sparse, about counting the syllables, which counteracted some of that kind of exaggeration, I suppose, of Disney itself.
Okay, interesting. And are you going to read a section of it for us?
So this is the first 3 pages of Disneyland. Making eye contact with a squirrel. For a second or 3 too long, I find myself still waiting for nature to wave back. Here you can really get up close. A chipmunk knees a toddler over. It's a delicatessen of animism, and its shopkeeper is a mouse. He flings out his arms in welcome. Michael, whistling dreamster. Michael Mouse, minstrel gloved, 4-fingered. No nursery of mites in your fur here. Air is textured with glockenspiel and popcorn. Not a leaf is out of place. One boy uttery with mommy, anticipating his 12 p.m. meet and greet with a lion. That they're capable of love, no one can be certain. Mothers in this particular landscape are, by tradition, evil or absent, and with my absent child, I sit in the shade of a castle, built in kind of, decorated in quite. Close by, a sparrow very small behaves as if this place is real. It's not. And knocks her beak against, I watch, a Thai green curry crisp on the cobbled floor. Several feathers are like a wave washed up untidily white on her side. Her flaxseed eye, unblinking, aloof. And all the time I notice this. A fly rests on my breast, like my breast's a piece of fruit in the 17th century Dutch still life.
Thank you. That is a really nice way to give us a taste for what we're not going to hear what's to come. You have to buy the book to read the rest of it. But I just, I love this reference to the mothers in this particular landscape being by tradition evil or absent, and the castle built in kind of and decorated in quite very much sort of Tesco architecture type thing. You know, sometimes you come across an actual landscape and a castle or something appears and you think, it looks too perfect. It's like a Disney castle. I think that always about Arundel Castle. I don't know if you've been down to the south, but whenever that appears on the horizon, Arundel Castle, wow, it's a Disney castle. No, it's a real castle, but it's too perfect.
It's kind of awful the way that Disney has changed our preconceptions of what things should be and made us think about reality as, in fact, artifice when it's not.
And also I love this image of a fly rests on my breast, like my breast a piece of fruit in a Dutch still life. In my mind, I'm picturing this very quiet, still, dark visual, which is so different from what you described, the maximalist of what's going on, like a moment of a pause, a reflection. I really like that.
And it absolutely was, actually, if I can just say that that was my lunch break, one of my days in Disneyland, and I was really taken with this little sparrow that was hopping around, at my feet, eating crumbs, and the fact that this was real nature. This was the bird that had chosen to come here and to exist within all these not quite real animals, and of course was eating this ultra processed food, this green Thai curry crisp, on this cobbled floor, producing a certain atmosphere and a certain feeling. So just so much happening, so many different aesthetics kind of clashing.
We talked briefly earlier about how children perhaps have more anxieties and the Greta Thunberg, the worries about what's happening to the world. And there are some quite serious poems here about extinction and ecological concerns. There's a poem which we meet a tree frog that we learn is going extinct. And then there's a second one when the demise of the tree frog is contemplated by, if I got this right, a woman having her period. So this was an interesting one. Release. I'm wondering whether you might read that for us, please.
Yeah, of course. I think this is quite a queasy poem, and in writing this book, I think the further I got into it, the more I was kind of intrigued by queasiness as a way of thinking around environmental ethics and kind of losing a moral compass in a way, and finding odd metaphors or comparisons that weren't quite right, but were still something I was feeling. So yes, this is Release. That night, when I got home, I learnt a tree frog species had been lost, and my body was releasing its usual sum of blood. I only had a few years left, my mother often warned, and I watched footage of the tree frog sitting about in its tank, the clip of the frog's lonely call. Was I angry or sorry? Whichever. This couldn't be called a crisis. It happened every month, and I went on, reading about the breeding programs, the experts' relentless watching of the frog, and, as if the amphibian was an unresponsive photocopier, their frustration, their tinkering, the time they spent waiting, the way my mother waited, and who could say whether I felt regret or happiness when the tender muscle cramped and spasmed, and the tree frog made its leap away, lost, they said, or maybe free.
So another tension, another contrast of being free or being lost, which is it? Maybe lost, maybe free of the world in which it no longer had its habitat. And I love the way you weave in the girl having her period, almost as if it's the same conversation. Reminded me of, I stood behind a mother and daughter in a queue in Primark recently, and the daughter was on her phone the whole time, and she was scrolling, texting, clicking, opening, closing, scrolling, texting, clicking, and all the same time having a conversation with her mother without drawing breath. And I just, how does she do those two things at the same time? And this reminded me of that kind of weaving of two things together. What is this person focusing on? The frog or the period? The mother saying, get on with it. You've only got so many years. And I love the way this wove all these things together.
Thank you. I think there was something for me about kind of the ticking of a clock. You know, we have the biological clock, obviously, which is very much present in this poem, but there's also the kind of the clock of extinction and environmental future and, you know, ticking down to what we don't quite know.
Yes,
but,
yes.
You know, there's often discussions about how many animals are going extinct within a single hour or a single day. So that was very much to the front of my mind as I was writing this poem.
I also like the fact that it's not a didactic, there's no kind of, I don't feel I'm being hit over the head with any kind of a message here. There's a lot of uncertainty, you know, a lot of questioning. Was I angry or sorry, whichever? And then waiting the way my mother waited, and who could say whether I felt regret or happiness? It's so nuanced.
I think for me, there's a lot of not knowing. And actually in the not knowing, that's where the poems might arise from. We can all perhaps try to be good green people where, you know, we are being environmentally thoughtful. But actually, there's lots of things that I do in my daily life which aren't perfect, and things that often we have no decision over, you know, because our options are limited. And so throwing away a hummus pot or something plastic in the rubbish, or not buying something which is organic, or, you know, whatever it might be, I kind of wanted to tap into the slight guilt I might feel, or again, that kind of queasy feeling of not having done something right, and the weird scale of thinking that way, where we think we might save the earth by not filling up the kettle to the top, you know, so we're not overusing energy. How kind of weird and absurd that can be. So holding everything in one space was important to me, I think, in that poem.
Who were your influences? What poets did you feel influenced you as you were growing up? How did you step into this world of poetry and start writing?
So my poetry journey definitely started as an angsty teenager. So, you know, a little bit like the person you might have described on the phone. If I'd had a phone growing up, I probably would have been that person, very much talking to everyone and my mum, maybe occasionally. It was a way of expressing, I suppose, what I was experiencing as a teenager, very kind of romantic, distraught poetry. I mean, gradually, I probably down to some of my studying and some of the moves I made in terms of location, I found myself in St Andrews in Scotland and very close to the seaside. I'd grown up by the seaside in Portsmouth, but I'd never really taken much notice of it. And then suddenly in Scotland, it was a little bit nicer, probably. You know, it had more birds, and I hope no one's going to be listening in from Portsmouth. But, you know, it was, I just felt like I was stimulated by, you know, the bird life, the sea life, the creatures that I was finding in rock pools. It was a very different landscape. I suddenly appreciated it so much more. And so the poem started to move towards a kind of ecological direction. I was really influenced by people like John Clare, so the peasant poet from the 18th century, you know, writing about birds' nests and birds' eggs, and that very small, zoomed in focus that he has in his poems, which I think kind of could be labelled as cute, but I'm sure everyone would disagree. And so it kind of grew from there. And then the poets that I started to read were people like Jen Hadfield. So a real focus on limpets and barnacles and lots of those kind of slightly strange and overlooked creatures that we find in the sea. And then poets like Jory Graham, an American poet who writes about the big ecological issues and about these questions around time and the future and what it might mean to be human and how that definition might be changing as our world changes.
Yes. Interesting. What project are you working on now? What's on the horizon? Do you want to talk about anything that's coming up?
I think at the close of Baby Steamer, as I was kind of finishing the book, I realised that there was so much more I wanted to say about cuteness, which I hadn't managed to fit in the poems. So questions kind of around nostalgia and how we might romanticise and maybe cutify ideas around a simpler time or a slower rhythm of the past connected with the natural world. And so I've started to write some non-fiction that's kind of exploring those ideas. And so these are kind of essays, which are kind of like lyric essays. So I'm bringing in a little bit of the poetry.
Interesting.
You know, it's not ready yet. But I will say it's something I have started exploring, and it's just a writing activity that allows me to keep my hand in, is to actually look at Instagram videos and kind of transcribe them. So I've actually have been transcribing Instagram videos of, cute puppies and cats and armadillos and whatever comes up on my feed. I will write down, and I'm not really sure where it's going, but it's interesting how the aesthetic changes, what's cute and kind of ephemeral and not worthy of note. Once you write it down, it takes on a different kind of gravitas. So that's been, a kind of interesting discovery of mine.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I'll bear that one in mind. I'm just wondering if we could finish with you reading a final poem from the book, and in fact, the final poem of the book as well, I think.
Birdwatching. A surprise to find amid this year's cohort of leaves, a bird with its back to me. What was the bird watching? Or was it staring into space, or into a thought all its own? I went to say, ahem, but it turned out my mouth was gone. A surprise, the bird with its back to me, as if I could be the background.
What a wonderful phrase to finish the book on. The bird with its back to me, as if I could be the background, suddenly putting the whole of humankind in its place, it felt like to me. What was your thinking when you wrote this poem?
It came from a very real encounter with a bird with its back to me, in which, I was kind of studying this bird, and I kind of expected, as you might expect, the bird to be aware of my presence, to maybe be fearful of it, or just to be kind of surveying, what's happening in its environment. Instead, it really wasn't. I wasn't of any importance. I wasn't a threat, which was probably good news, but I just wasn't anything. And I suppose it allowed me just to have that moment of a perspective change. I was very aware in writing the book that there is a lot of I, and with my first book there wasn't. I think it was a little less involved. I was a little less involved. And so I really enjoyed this moment of not being in the scene almost, or kind of wanting to be in the scene, trying to encroach, wondering, why am I not important? There was something really joyful about being in the background, actually, and allowing the bird to say the final, or have the final word, in a way.
I really liked it. It was a gentle ending, and as I say, I felt like it put humankind in its place, just reminding us, actually, nature's going to go on, no matter what we do. And if we destroy the world for us, there'll still be a world for something. Some creatures will come back. And I rather liked that. It felt quite hopeful, really, quite positive.
Yeah, I very much like the idea. I think so often we think around birds and our landscape as background, right, to our own human dramas and activities.
Absolutely.
But this bird, I like the idea that it's having a dream of its own. It's taking its time. It has its own viewpoint on the world.
It's a great place to end. And I just want to say a huge thank you, Isabel, for coming on and telling us about the book and reading your poems. And it's been really lovely.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for the questions and for reading the book so thoughtfully. It's been a delight to answer these prompts from you and to think about the book in a new way.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, and all the best in your next projects.
So we're left with a blackbird resolutely ignoring Isabel. And there was something kind of passive-aggressive about that blackbird, which I really liked. And I think that the territory that she's carved out for herself is absolutely marvellous. I love this kind of cuteness. I've just been reading an essay by Freud called The Uncanny, and I also read a book about weirdness and eeriness the other day. And it seems to me this cuteness, the way it becomes increasingly sinister, that sort of squeeze-a-mole thing, which I had to look up, that sort of unicorns and teddy bears and big-eyed weird things, but they're all very squeezy and designed to be hugged.
Yes.
Not really having your best interests at heart.
Yeah, there is something very, you can flip over from being cute and lovable to somewhat weird, eerie. In fact, the cover of the book, the image on the cover of the book is of a toy rabbit that's sort of been discarded, kind of lying on the ground with nothing else going on, almost like a murder scene,
Yeah,
Just like...
sort of a steel rabbit on his back.
Yeah.
This book I've just read, I can't remember who wrote it. It's called The Weird and the Eerie. Eeriness is like, the Marie Celeste. You sort of discover something that some unknown force has created, a disaster in a lonely place. And weirdness is something that shouldn't be there, but is, like a strange sea monster just kind of coming out of the sea at a town or something.
Which is a bit like the Squeeze-A-Mile idea of these creatures that aren't really recognisable creatures. They started off as toy rabbits or toy giraffes, but they've kind of gone over into GM version of real animals.
Yeah. There's that way in which this cuteness hijacks what's a normal response. Human response to a little thing with big eyes and everything is protective, but actually it's kind of inserted this artificial thing into that relationship. So you find yourself loving something that isn't really what it's presenting to be. So that's kind of like a definition of the uncanny, something that's homely, but kind of, sinister as well, like a doll that suddenly moves its eyes or something.
That's a real trope, isn't it, in horror movies? Dolls, puppets, masks, things that come to life that shouldn't.
So Isabel's territory of the cuteness, to my mind anyway, is certainly akin to those things. There's a kind of edginess and a dubiousness about these things we think are cute.
We talked about the Tamagotchis and the Japanese, the anime, the stylized design of characters in those cartoons. And you've spent a bit of time in Japan, haven't you, Peter? So you know a bit about this cutesy aesthetic as it comes out in Japanese culture.
I've had 2 holidays there, but even in that short exposure, this idea of kawaii, which is Japanese for cuteness or lovability, it's everywhere. All the Hello Kitty type stuff that Japan has produced, it just permeates all levels of their culture. Last time I was there was 11 years ago, but thinking of the fashion, that I saw a woman dressed like a pink doll, with a little dog in a pram and a big bow on her head and a lacy white parasol. I saw her from a bus when I was in Tokyo. What I love about Japanese culture is that people really commit to a look. It was just absolutely perfect. There's a kind of language, a kind of alphabet of cute, a kawaii in Japan. And it's sort of very kind of rounded script, and it's inserts all hearts and stars and emoticon faces into it. The schools in the 80s and things had to kind of stamp out this kind of kawaii language and writing, but it turns out it was developed mainly by teenage girls. Of course, later marketing's got hold of it. But I think what Isabel was doing is I love the way that she's digging into this cute and the implied need and what that stimulates in her. In Baby Schema, that poem, she says, "I'm still a child, or want to be, the one cared for." And there is that kind of the absence of love and nurture that these cutesy things feed into. It makes us feel like children and kind of in a safe world.
Yeah.
But being a poet, Isabel's kind of found areas of darkness, that uneasy interplay that she has between the natural world and the Disneyland cute world.
I thought that was really interesting, the whole Disney aspect of the real ducks on the lake and then Donald Duck round the corner.
Yeah.
And tying into this idea of, do children these days take on too much responsibility? Are they sort of heavy with the pending extinction of the world?
Yeah.
In a way that years back that wasn't the case. The children were kind of protected from that. So at the same time that adults are yearning for perhaps babyhood with the cuteness that goes on.
Yeah.
At the same time as children actually sort of becoming less able to be children for a long time because they're exposed to the world's issues.
It is a place of safety, that cuteness, but that cuteness has been sexualized as well. There are other elements. These are really splendid and kind of tight poems with lots of space for the imagination. and dark as well, like that forever it appears, that squeezing of that soft frog thing which rebounds into shape.
Yeah,
There's a kind of desperate, almost like a stress ball aspect to that thing.
Totally. I was really excited by this book.
Yeah.
I thought it was very, very different, very original, and very well executed.
I loved her account of creeping off to Disneyland, not having been there before.
Yes, and sort of slightly sheepish, doing her research there and wondering whether it's real research.
But not really having been involved with Disney very much as a child,
Yes, which must have made it an exciting project, really, something completely fresh.
Well, my first experience of Disney was going to watch, was it Snow White in the cinema back in the 60s, and having to be taken out because I was so terrified of the witch.
You were a sensitive boy.
I was, still am.
Now, I went to an event in London recently, which was great fun.
Mm.
It was the celebration and prize giving, kind of, for the Foyle Young Poets of the Year Awards. Do you know about that, Peter?
It's obviously very famous and well attended.
It's been going since 1998, apparently, and it's run by the Poetry Society, and it's sponsored by the Foyle Foundation, hence the title. It's a competition for young people aged between 11 and 18. And they get entrants from all over the world. It's not just a UK thing. And it's huge. And this year, I think they had over 17,000 poems submitted from nearly 7,000 young poets, apparently. So it's quite heartwarming in the sense that one hears so many stories now about how poetry is taught in schools or not taught, and kids are just put off poetry, or certainly so-called page poetry, because of they're just being made to read stuff that they feel has no relevance to them. And I think also probably teachers are a bit at sea as well. That if you've got teachers that don't really understand or appreciate poetry, then there's no chance that they're going to be able to instill any enthusiasm in their pupils. But clearly there are teachers who are absolutely doing that. And some of the teachers also get recognised each year for having done a great job of encouraging the writing of poetry in their schools. So anyway, so this year, so basically there's a big shebang, a big prize giving at the British Library. And the two judges this year were Jack Underwood,
who we've had on the poddy,
absolutely, and Vanessa Kisule. Basically, there are 100 commended poets, and the top 15 are considered the winners, and they all get the chance to read their poem in this auditorium. Their poems are also included in a very nice anthology, which I have in front of me here, produced by the Poetry Society. Yes, it's great. And they also receive there's all kinds of prizes. They get mentoring and all kinds of other benefits, and the Poetry Society are very keen to stress how they nurture these young poets in their future careers, so they'll be given other opportunities to do things. And so it's a fantastic start, really, isn't it?
How amazing if you're one of the chosen ones.
Absolutely.
Were these 15 reading them at the reading you went to?
Yeah, I think we had readings from maybe 12 or 13. There were certainly a couple that couldn't be there because they were from abroad. Although one of them had come all the way from California, I think, to read. So that's impressive.
How were the kids at reading? Were they? Was there a range?
There was a range, and I suppose if there's one thing, if I were ever to be asked for my feedback, I would suggest that they maybe were given a little help with reading their poems in public before the actual public reading. I mean, maybe that's too much to expect. Maybe that's just that makes it more stressy. Maybe the idea is just don't worry, just read your poem and the rest will come later. But some of them particularly could have really done their poems more justice if they had slowed down and thought about their delivery But hey, we're talking about 15-year-olds here, and
Wow.
it's a huge auditorium and it's a big event, so shouldn't be too critical, really.
I mean, absolutely, nerve-wracking and wonderful at the same time, I expect, for those kids.
Yeah. But some of them were very good, actually, and you could sort of tell the kids that perhaps went to schools where they are taught presentation skills and that sort of thing, dare I say it. So some of the poems were quite long, but I've just got one here that's not too long. I thought I might just give an airing to. And it's by Indy Moon, who I read in the biog at the back of the book, is an 18-year-old student. She's doing her A-levels at the moment in history, English literature and psychology. And it's called Loud. Wine spins at the bottom of our glasses. Words collect on the table in front of us, and I forget to double-check the thoughts as they leave my head. Love shouted across the kitchen. At 6 years old, I didn't know love could be loud. I didn't realise kitchens were more than knives. Lend me your mascara. Mess their hair into place. Here, stay still, as glitter falls onto our shoulders. Fake unis. Games no one loses. Your plate is mine. And I'm sure they can all hear us. I'm tipsy enough not to care. Pull over. Finish screaming the song. I haven't had my hands out the window in years. I think we could touch the clouds.
Well, that's full of a kind of building exuberance, isn't it?
It's lovely. I
can see why people enjoyed that.
Yeah. Well done, and good luck to Indy Moon. In fact, there are quite a few poets today, successful working poets, who have come through the Foyle Awards scheme. So people like Hannah Lowe, Helen Mort.
Wow.
A lot of names that you would know.
Because sometimes it's like under 15 teams at professional football clubs. There's lots of people in there and only a smattering of them ever get heard of or played in the first team or whatever.
Yeah. I think it is true. And of course, we know it's a very competitive field. Not everybody does, but I think a good number of these young poets do go on to, if not be published poets themselves, certainly working in the sector and working for poetry-related organisations. So it definitely feeds people into the poetry world, if you like. So it's a great thing.
And just the experience of being taken seriously enough to be asked to read somewhere massive like that and something, it's quite a big step.
There was at least one person amongst the prize winners who was also a winner last year. Quite often they go on, if they start young, they're in the winners list 2 or 3 years running. So they're probably the ones who are perhaps, the ones to watch, as it were, but a massive achievement. Were you ever a young poet, Peter? Would you have entered any competitions as a teenager if there was anything like this? Not sure I would have.
No, probably not. I started writing when I was 15. Very privately, mawkish, ghastly things.
Oh, yeah. We have to start with that, don't we?
But I took it quite seriously, but I didn't really send anything out to competitions. I've always been a bit wary of them. But I got my first things published when I was 22, I think. So I was kind of a young poet for a while.
Oh, well done. That's great. You were better in that early age than I was.
I was one of these people that loved all kinds of artistic things. So I did A-level art as well, for example. And the temptation was to go off into 1,000 different directions at the same time, which still stays with me, of course. But I had a very intense kind of frowny few years of just living and breathing poetry.
Frowny, did you say? Frowny.
Yeah, frowny, intense and convinced of my own genius and so on.
Because a lot of poets did die young, so they must have been young poets to start with.
I was trying to think of young writers that I liked. And of course, in a completely contrary way, I went back wildly into the past. And one of my poetic loves is John Keats.
Ah, yes.
Who, of course, died when he was 25 in Italy. His grave says something like, "Here lies one whose name is written on water."
Yeah.
I mean, my God.
Yeah, I've seen that
cool.
in Rome. Yeah, that famous grave that we go to look at in Rome. Yeah.
Never been there, yeah.
And his house also at the bottom of the Spanish Steps that you can visit. So you get the full vibe.
Yeah. we've got very different opinions of his letters, haven't we? Because I read them and thought, what an interesting person he was, and you read them thinking he was somebody you'd like cross the road to avoid.
It's a shame, isn't it? I don't know. I just remember all the snittiness, but I mean, I'm sure it wasn't just him.
I went through a phase of reading all about him and how he trained as a surgeon and so on. And
yes, he did, didn't he?
so he'd seen all kinds of wild things while still in his teens. Gone to. I think the description of the surgery at the time was very, very agricultural and sawing people's legs off and throwing them in buckets and so on. So Keats obviously died of TB. There's his Keats house in Hampstead.
Yes.
I went there once and went to the bedroom, and there was a little information on the wall with a quote saying, "I know this blood, it's arterial," after he had his first coughing thing and coughed up blood.
Oh, really?
So he was writing with that sense of his own imminent demise always there, and in his finest work, I think something like Ode to a Nightingale, that sense of being coaxed through the trees by this kind of, while he's half in love with easeful death, that sense of death is seductive and inevitable, and he's turning it into something quite beautiful in a way. I thought I'd take this opportunity to read a bit of Keats.
Oh, yes, please do.
And seeing as we're recording this in October, I'm glancing out of the window now and the skies are threatening rain.
Yeah.
But just yesterday I was out in the countryside and everything was blue-skied and golden. It makes the heart soar.
It's a lovely time of year.
Well, it is. I've always thought it's perfect for poetry, really, because it's beautiful and it's sad. So, so much of poetry is the both of those things.
Yeah, good point.
I'll give this a go, and
lovely,
because it's almost like covering a Beatles song or something with a banjo, isn't it? Really, somebody else.
Oh no! Don't be like no. What are we going to hear? To Autumn.
To Autumn by Johnny Keats. Johnny Keats? No, by John Keats. Actually, Byron called him Johnny Pissabed Keats in one of his letters.
I rest my case. They didn't have a middle name, John E. Keats. No. Richard E. Grant. Oh, this is terribly flippant. Now we want to hear a bit of Keats. Do it.
Okay. To Autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with a patient look, thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Ay, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies.
It's a lovely one, isn't it? So many beautiful images there, and the fumes. I always like the fumes of the poppies. It makes me think of him being drugged with opium, hopefully in his last hours, to ease his way to death. But no, lovely.
I was reading somebody writing about this and saying it's all in the present tense, and there's something about this kind of some autumn that's there forever and never passes. There is that sense of he was aware that he was probably on the way out, and he was yearning for Fanny Braun, and
yeah.
It's full of that wistfulness. It's not so explicit as in some of his other poems, but there is that, why autumn? Why is it this turning of the year into that last flush of glory that he's so focused on?
Not melancholic, but
no.
Yes, as you say, prescient, I suppose.
I read a biography of him some time ago, and they were saying that he absolutely consumed Shakespeare. That he just kind of inhaled it and learned so much from it in terms of, engaging all the senses when you're writing, and such a wealth of language that he kind of magpied from the bard.
Magpied from the bard. Lovely.